Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at the next episode of our LinkedIn Live series, where we interview practitioners and specialists in the subjects of social selling and employee advocacy. And I've got an absolute pleasure today to be joined by Douglas Cole from LinkedIn. Hello, Douglas.
Very nice to see you again, Justina.
Great to see you as well. Slightly different situation this time.
Yeah.
So last time we met, just for those of you who don't know, I think a few months ago, we took part, or I took part in a debate that you were leading, Doug, that was organized by LinkedIn. And I know that several subjects that we discussed during this debate, especially one including what top sales professionals do differently, really stood out to me. And I know that we connected afterwards and you've got loads of tips and frameworks to share that you share with your audiences through your book and through a variety of different events that you take part in. And I just thought it would be absolutely brilliant if you could join and share these with our audience. So I really appreciate you agreeing to do that. And once again, I just want to welcome you to the show.
Yeah, well, I think you and I have a lot of common interests, so it's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Amazing. Thank you. So maybe let's start with, for those of you who don't know you, three simple yet maybe profound questions: who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do.
Yeah, those are profound questions. Who are you? So my name is Doug Cole. I'm based in Toronto. I wear basically two hats career-wise. So my day job, so to speak, is that I lead a sales team at LinkedIn. It's an enterprise sales team. These are sales professionals who are trying to grow our relationships with large enterprise clients. And then the other career hat is basically a teaching hat. I lead professional development courses within LinkedIn, but also externally, I co-teach courses on consulting fundamentals and sales fundamentals with a couple of business schools here in Toronto. So those are my two main career hats, I would say.
Why these two? Why do you do what you do, Doug?
Well, I really enjoy the craft of teaching because it forces you to sharpen your learning in the area that you're teaching in. So I suppose I'm just an inveterate learner. I enjoy the process of learning, and I enjoy the process of trying to distill and bucketize and just organize my learnings into ways that are useful for me and for other people. So that's basically what teaching requires you to do, and that's why it's a source of energy for me, and it's effectively a second career. So
I can certainly relate to that. Yes, I think, as you said, that teaching forces you to learn more as well, and forces you to also organize your knowledge in a way that it's clearer to then pass it to others.
Yeah,
absolutely relatable here. So is it it's the knowledge about what top performance salespeople do differently, right? I can see, I know that that's something that is really of interest to you, and I've watched some of the interviews that people have done with you, and we've connected on that subject as well, where I see your big interest lies in is not only in the skill set and the tool set required for the salesperson to perform at their best, but beyond all, mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about this? Maybe let's start with, how do you define mindset? I've seen loads of definition of that.
Yeah, well, very, very good question, and you are definitely getting to the heart of the matter. I suppose the reason why it appeals to me is that I'm just so conscious, and you would have seen this or you remember this from our conversation, but I'm just so conscious of the fact that our attention is being swarmed from so many different angles. And so if you are in a position, if you have the role of a leader and of a coach and a mentor, you're constantly asking yourself, what should I prioritize amidst all the different things that someone could pay attention to? What is going to give me the greatest leverage? What is going to give this person the greatest leverage if that person is looking to improve? And so that, from a teaching perspective or from a coaching perspective, leads you to look at, essentially three different ways of helping someone get better. You can focus on tool set, you can focus on skill set, and you can focus on mindset. Each one of these things is important. I view mindset, and I'm not the only one, but I certainly agree that mindset is sort of the lead domino for all three. You can't just make someone great by giving a new technical tool or otherwise. You can't make someone great just by focusing on skill development. There is this third piece, which again I think I think of as a foundational piece. And mindset I defined as basically the way that the essentially your theory of the game, the way you see yourself and the way you see the game that you're playing, and that has massive implications for the way you show up. If you think about if you just think about life in general and the way that most people grow up, I have a teenage daughter, for instance, and I noticed that my daughter's performance changed dramatically from the time that she decided that she saw herself as a good student. The minute she saw herself as somebody who is very capable and is therefore sort of deservedly at the top of her class in whatever topic she was focused on. The minute she had that view of herself and of the game she was playing, in this case school, that was what changed her approach. That's what actually made her put in the extra time and focus her studying to a degree that she hadn't before. And I think the same thing happens in the professional realm. The minute you change the frame for what it is that you think you are doing and what it is that you think you should be accomplishing, then that has a lot of ramifications for the way that you apply yourself to the task at hand. And so mindset for me is really important to get right, as this foundational piece. What are you really trying to do as a sales professional? What is the appropriate way to define what a sales professional is trying to accomplish in a B2B sale? And that's what I get into in my book.
Okay. And in your book as well, you explain that mindset changes, right? That depending where you are in your sales career, or whether you are at the starting point or you've got more experience, there's this trajectory that you've observed people follow. Could you give us a bit more overview of that? Because I found this really, really interesting to understand that better.
Yeah. What I have observed is that when people start out in sales, the people who are new to the profession are generally uncomfortable, either consciously or unconsciously, with the fact that they're trying to get a busy stranger to buy something which may or may not be necessary. And the seller tends to process that discomfort by trying to be as likable and as charming as possible. So that's sort of the first stage of development, is likability. Then as the seller gets better, they start to think about what's in their interest, what's in the client's interest, how can they engineer a win-win outcome. And so that's the second stage that I've called mutuality. And then there's a third level, which is a pretty rarefied space to be. And that is when the seller graduates to a point where they're thinking not just about being charming, not just about getting to a win-win outcome, but they're actually operating as a trusted advisor. There's someone they become someone who has achieved a plausible level of objectivity on the client's problem. And that state, objectivity, I think is what I would describe as the state that the top performers manage to arrive at. And it's funny, every time I mention this 3-tiered journey, I always get head nods from sellers, because they all agree that they have gone through at least the first stage of this journey. Many of them are in the second and trying to get to the third, or are conscious of having arrived at the third. But yeah, I think it tends to resonate with people in sales. They can all relate to that emotional maturity that happens as they get better.
Yes, definitely. And don't you find this interesting as well, that there's not much said about this in general in terms of sales literature, and also, I guess, business education in general? Like how do you get to that state? How can you gain more awareness of the fact that that is the road, if up until today, yes, where perhaps we've got now this resource that is based on your research, where you define it in so clear terms. There wasn't much said on this subject.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was? I don't know if it's the right question, but I would
No,
love
no,
to hear your angle on this.
it's a very interesting question, and I can definitely, this question resonates with me because I have been through a so-called traditional business education. I have done an MBA, and I have not only done an MBA, but I've also worked in consulting. And those two experiences, when I look back on them, are really striking in the sense that there was no sales education that happened when I was going through an MBA, and nor did I do any projects while I was in the consulting space. I didn't do any projects, maybe one actually, but really it was not part of my consulting experience. I did many industries and functions and verticals, but not really in sales. And I think there's a basic reason for this, maybe two reasons. One is that MBA schools in general are a sort of barometer for the sources of prestige within business at any given time. And so that is why you'll find that the majority of MBA graduates historically have gone into consulting and finance after graduating from MBA programs, because those careers are considered to be prestigious careers. More recently, there's been an increasing percentage of MBA graduates who get into venture capital and entrepreneurship, because that too is now considered a prestigious area to get into. Sales was never really considered prestigious. As you know, sales has historically had a bit of a black eye, a bit of a branding problem, being perceived as an area of business that people never intentionally get into. They get into it by accident. It attracts people who may or may not have a business education. It attracts people or it incentivizes people to behave in manipulative ways. And so there are all these negative associations with sales, which have, I think, held business programs back from including sales in their education. There's no objective reason for it. You can do all sorts of rigorous analysis as to what goes on in a sales function and how to optimize it, no less than you can in other functions. But it just hasn't been featured, I think, for this reputational reason. I do think that this is starting to change. I think that there is a recognition now, and maybe it relates to the growing importance of entrepreneurship as a career to promote within MBA programs. But I think there's a growing recognition right now that sales is the engine of growth for high growth companies. And therefore, if you are going to acquire a generalist business education, you need to include sales as part of that curriculum. And so I do think that I see signs within the spaces that I move in, in business schools. I do see signs of programs starting to be built in reputable business schools that seem to acknowledge that this is now something that is a requisite. So yeah, I think change is afoot, but historically speaking, I think that explains it.
Okay, great. This is very, very interesting. So in terms of this journey that the salesperson can go through, of the different mindset that can be achieved, what needs to happen in order to get to that third level?
Yeah. Well, I think that it happens. There is this stepwise progression. It's no coincidence that it's only after you recognize the limitations of the previous two stages, the limitations of being likable and the limitations of just being really forthright about your mutual interests. I think what you discover, there's a certain amount of experience, I think, that's required for someone to appreciate what those limitations are. I think that fundamentally, though, it is a matter of it's a matter of understanding that empathy, as we typically think of it, for a client, needs to be thought about a little bit differently. And historically, when you think of traditional sales programs and the way people typically advise sellers to get better at their craft, is they talk about just being empathetic to your client, really trying not to make it all about you, make it about them. And I think that's obviously good advice. I think that advice needs to be taken to another level when you are talking about a B2B buying scenario and when you're talking about becoming a trusted advisor, because I think empathy properly understood within the B2B context, is it's about understanding these three dimensions that I talk about in my book, which is the external dimension, the organizational dimension, and the interpersonal dimension. It's not simply understanding, it's not simply showing that you care about that person. It is about understanding that every B2B conversation, if you think about it, involves this intersection of what's happening in the external environment, what is determining whether this company is either gaining competitive advantage or losing it. It impacts the organizational context. What's really going on in this company? What are the themes that are getting a lot of mind share, a lot of airplay? Who are the people who are influencing the decisions and the cultural evolution within that company? And then the third is this interpersonal dimension of what really matters to this person, what is going to get this person to care and to take action. And those are the three dimensions, the external, organizational, and interpersonal. And so it's only once you start to develop your theory of the game of sales and understand that it's operating on these three levels that you start to, I think, step it up and focus more on how you can become a trusted advisor.
Okay, so you're saying once you start developing the theory of the game,
yeah,
how do you start then? If we were to go down into this first level, that is becoming a strategist, as you said, that basically salespeople can become, there are three mindsets that they could approach, right? That they could become a strategist, they could become a change agent, and they could become a decision architect. What would it require then for the salesperson to become a strategist specifically? Because this is really the theme as well of this in the B2B world.
Well, what I've tried to do in this book, and in many respects, this book is just an attempt to distill a lot of complex topics, down to a couple of questions in order to prompt a higher level of curiosity and, a series of actions. What I've tried to do is I've tried to shift the frame by asking a couple of questions that pertain to each of these realms in order to start the salesperson down an investigative process. So I think that in order to understand that external realm, the two questions that you need to ask are, where does this company compete and how will this company win? And those two questions are basically the heart of what it means to have a strategy. A company, the word strategy is a little bit of a meaningless term nowadays. People talk about strategy all the time, and it's sort of a buzzword in business. People generally associate it with higher level or more sophisticated thinking. But there is actually a clear conceptual definition to strategy, and it basically comes down to what are the really hard choices and trade-offs that this company has made in order to determine how it can compete and win relative to its competitors in the same market, right? And so when you ask yourself those two questions, how do they, or where do they compete? What is the specific area of the market they've chosen to focus on, and therefore what have they excluded? And then how will they win? In other words, what are the distinctive advantages of this company, or what should be the distinctive advantage of this company? Those are the questions that should start you off on the first dimension of thinking about this external dimension and how that matters ultimately to a buying decision. Then similarly, in the case of the organizational dimension, when you talk about becoming a change agent, there are a couple of key questions there. Where is the energy for change coming from in this company? And the second question is, how can I feed that energy? What you'll find at any given time in any organization is that there's a ton of stuff going on. It's no longer the case that there are just discrete change management initiatives. Every company is constantly in a process of change. They're constantly trying to adjust and pivot to external pressures. And so what you need to figure out is where is most of the energy coming from? What are the themes and the topics that are being continuously reinforced at the company level in team meetings? What's getting a lot of airplay? And once you determine those energy sources, usually it's not more than a couple, because people can't pay attention to more than that as a whole. Then you can ask, well, how can I feed that energy? How can this product or service benefit from that pre-existing energy source? How can I accelerate the change process that is going on right now? And so those are the two questions that relate to this organizational dimension. And then the third, I talked about this interpersonal, I think, again, the most important questions there are, what really matters to this person? How can I get this person to care and take action? And I think that there it's a matter of understanding some of the basic principles of psychology. Going back to one of the themes that I've talked about a lot, I know that you know this as well, is that this information revolution that we're living through right now is probably the single most important thing that sort of informs everything that we're experiencing. The fact that we have so much information being created and thrown at us all the time just has huge ramifications for the sales process. And so you need to know, what is it that I need to single out from all that information that is likely to get the attention of this individual and is likely to trigger some form of action. So that's what I've tried to do, essentially, to make it practical, is to say, yeah, okay, so all fine to talk about this mindset. How can you take some first steps in order to build that mindset? And I think that step starts with these core questions within each of those three realms, and trying to push yourself to answer them as a way to think about your sales thesis and your sales process.
This is great. This is specific. So basically, you can have a list of questions, these kind of questions, 2 questions. This is what I love, the simplicity of your approach. 2 questions for each one of these approaches, and then start with that as your research. I think the latest State of Sales report by LinkedIn said that salespeople spend less time selling, and actually top performing salespeople actually spend more time researching nowadays than actually speaking to potential prospects and preparing proposals, etc. So you probably see where I'm going with this, because my next question will be, how do you then do that research? Where could you go? What sources could you use beyond, I guess what I'm trying to get is beyond the conversation with the client where you can ask these questions, where else you could find this information to perhaps from the beginning, from the first conversation that you're having with the buyer, you basically elevate the conversation to a different level.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're pushing for specifics. So let's continue down that path. I think that yes, you're absolutely right. It is a somewhat paradoxical finding that the top performers seemingly spend about 10% time less selling, ignoring maybe the obvious debate around what we mean by selling. I mean, should we classify research as selling? Ignoring that for a second, yes, the general point is that buyers have less and less time to engage with sellers, because sellers just have less and less time to talk to the buyer, sellers have less and less time to talk to the seller. And so there are increasing limits on the interaction between the two. And even with those limits, the best sellers seem to spend even less time in directly engaging with the client and more time researching. And I think that if we go back to these 3 categories and think about, just practically speaking, how to approach them from a research perspective. So if you go into this, if you're researching this client, let's start with the strategy angle. One of the things that I think makes a lot of sense is to go to your LinkedIn data and other sources of data, but we just take LinkedIn data as an example. In Sales Navigator, if you pull up a company and you pull up insights on that company, you'll see how fast that company is growing by headcount. You see the rate at which they're posting new jobs. You'll see the comparative performance in terms of headcount growth overall and by function. You'll see that compared to what LinkedIn identifies as its important competitors in the market. So I think what you want to do is understand what is the relative performance of this company in contrast to its competitors. What is defining that? What is driving that difference? What can you find out about the growth strategy of this company that helps you understand what they're trying to do differently from their main competitors in that space? Right. So that's how you would start to build some data and build some hypotheses around where do they compete and how do they win. Then when you get into the next level, which is this organizational piece of where is the energy for change and how can I feed that energy? I think you can also use a combination of just lots of first-person interviews with people in the organization, as well as data. If you go to LinkedIn and you look at the people who have joined that organization, within the last year, those are really, very important people to know. It's important to know who those people are. It's important to find time on their calendars in order to understand what it is that they're trying to drive. Generally speaking, when someone is new to an organization, that person is looking to make an impact, is looking to build their legacies, so to speak, from the early days. And so you want to understand, why is it that this person was hired? What distinctive expertise was this person hired for? And what does that mean in terms of the change they're trying to drive in that organization? So that would start to build your hypothesis around the energy source and how to feed it.
And that just to add to here, that reminds me that there is actually even a filter within Sales Navigator where you can actually go to people who work in specific company and how many of them, I'm trying to remember, joined the company in the past. Yeah, gosh, now I can't remember exactly what the filter is, but you can actually look specifically for the people who joined the company recently. So that could narrow down your research in terms of figuring out who's the right person to approach.
Yeah, there are actually, on that organizational piece, there are a number of filters that have a lot of practical value. So there's the one you just mentioned, which is, finding the people who are relatively new, they've joined within the last year. There's another filter. There are a couple other ones that are really helpful. One is to find alumni of your own company. So you look for people who used to work at your own company who now work at the client organization. Because generally speaking, a fellow alumnus or alumna is going to be receptive to your outreach and sort of help you understand what's going on the inside. That's another angle. You can also find alumni of some of your top clients. If you find, if there is a particular organization with whom you do have a really strong relationship, you can look for alumni of that company at your target organization and use that as a basis for building new connection and new understanding of what's top of mind. So yeah, there are a variety of filters within Navigator that help you identify certain subsets of employees that can help you build that picture of what matters in the organization. And then the third is this interpersonal piece, and that I think that's a little bit more bespoke. When you're asking yourself what matters to this person, how can I get this person to care? There are some general principles to bear in mind. In the book, I talk about the area of behavioral economics and how important that is to someone who's in sales, because the sales challenge is perfectly reflected in the general organizing principles of behavioral economics. Behavioral economics, for the benefit of your viewers, perhaps some of them, it was or is an area of study, academic study, that was that was reacted to traditional economics by saying that it was lacking something. Traditional economics used to contend that human beings are basically rational agents and we all make rational decisions at the individual and society level. And behavioral economics said, no, that's clearly not true. We can show you all kinds of evidence that proves that we're not rational. We make decisions for very systematically biased reasons. And so what behavioral economics did was sort of organize a whole new area based on these observable limits on human attention, human rationality, and human self-interest. And those limits are basically what a salesperson is dealing with. You're working within limits of attention. As a salesperson, you're trying to get someone to notice. You're working within limits of rationality in the sense that you're trying to get someone to make a judgment about your product or service, and you're working within limits of self-interest in the sense that you need to be able to speak to what matters, what is in that person's interest in order to get that person to take action and care. So I think that on that dimension, the research is about understanding what it is that will define this person's success in that company, what it is that will help this person become recognized and rewarded, and how can you support that with your initiative. So those are some practical ways, I think, to try to solve this mystery.
Great tips, really great tips. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yes, I am pushing for the specifics. I guess this is the trainer in me trying to figure out, if I was to digest the most out of this conversation and pass it over to others, what would that be? And also in terms of specific practical action that people could take. So yes, I am aware that I'm
okay. It's all good. It's all good.
Okay, I'm curious then, because we're talking about, okay, again, specific actions that someone could take when it comes to approaching this these three different levels, these three different dimensions that could help them become a trusted advisor, yes, someone that achieves also that plausible objectivity to which you are referring. I'm just curious, what's your opinion on what role does salesperson's presence on LinkedIn play when it comes to the sales process? I mean, if their presence in terms of what they share and what they interact with when it comes to the content, the LinkedIn content.
Well, I think that one of the most important things to understand is that there are going to be different constituencies that look at your profile, and you need to think about what those constituencies are. I think historically, most people assumed, this is now a pretty outdated assumption, but most people assumed that the purpose of a LinkedIn profile was just basically to have an online resume, and that when you thought about the content in your profile, you thought about it through the eyes of a recruiter who was looking to maybe offer you a new job. And so when you read many profiles, you'll see evidence of that. They talk about themselves in the third person. They sort of talk about their career accomplishments and that sort of thing, as if it's being read by a recruiter. I think that you need to acknowledge that there are going to be clients who look at your profile, and what is it that you want that client to think? It's a bit of a different angle, and I think that I would suggest you'd want the client to have a sense of, first of all, we always want to know what motivates somebody. What's someone's story? I think it's helpful to be clear about what is it that gives you energy. What is it that drives you in your career? What are you aspiring to? I think that basic story needs to be there. Your profile should be more than just some bullet points. It should be some indication of what matters to you in a deeper sense. And then the other thing is, I think that you should demonstrate your expertise. What is it that gives you a competitive advantage? Just as we were talking before about companies and how companies themselves need to define their relative strengths in contrast to competitors. I think that something needs to happen similarly with the way you define yourself. We are also sort of independent brands, and you need to define what is distinct about your brand. What are the things that make you uniquely valuable to clients? So I think that angle, it's a bit of a different angle than the traditional one when people think about their profile, but that's the one that's worth thinking a little bit more about.
These are great questions, absolutely brilliant prompts for people to think about when optimizing their profile, right? What gives you energy? What drives you? What is it that you are trying to accomplish? What makes you distinct from others? It's this kind of question of, I think you talked about it as well in your book, executives are so busy nowadays. Mm-hmm. Why does this matter? Why should I speak to this person is one of the first questions that they will have. Will this person provide me with value? Will this person listen? Or will I just spend half an hour with someone trying to push their agenda without focusing on what's important for me?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And also, we have a natural tendency to want to organize the world according to stories, right? That's how our brains make sense of information. And that's why we have, for millennia, been attracted to stories. And so your own story is also important. If you think about an executive mindset, an executive is looking at the sort of chaotic situation, is coming into every new situation and asking himself or herself, okay, well, who are the characters in this story? Okay, so-and-so has just reached out to me. What is this character in this story that I'm now involved with, right? And so the way you describe yourself, the way you describe your motivations and what drives you, that's part of what makes it easier for the executive to know, okay, I understand who this person is and how I can fit him or her into the story here.
Fascinating. I've never thought about it that way. This is really, really interesting. So really, your profile and your presence on LinkedIn, that first impression that somebody will have about you and your story and your drivers before they decide to engage in any kind of dialogue with you.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to take it as a given that, generally speaking, in many times when a buyer is working with a sales rep, that buyer will have done a significant amount of research on their own before that interaction. They will have gathered information about your company, and they may well have gathered information about you. And so what is it that you want them to think? What do you want them to conclude?
Okay, so almost that way you can be more in charge of what is it that they are going to find about you if you take proactive effort in building a brand for yourself as whom exactly? What should a salesperson aspire to be? Just once again, if we could just kind of round it up with what you mentioned before, if they were to define themselves, what could they use as?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say that, I mean, this goes back to the branding problem that we talked about initially. So we need to acknowledge that this branding problem exists, and it exists for understandable reasons. There are manipulative sellers, and there are situations in the world where somebody has a job to sell something which that person may not actually believe in all that strongly. And that could create some perverse incentives in the buyer-seller dynamic. So that exists. That is the reality of the world we live in, and that informs, and that is what is responsible for the caution and the skepticism that a lot of clients bring to their initial conversation with a salesperson. So I would say the most important thing to get right in your profile is to dispense with any risk of you being perceived that way. And the best way to eliminate or at least significantly reduce that risk is to talk about, again, what is it that drives you? What is it that helps you to deliver value to clients in a way that creates a virtuous circle between, the product or the service that you are representing and the interests of the client? How is it that you really derive your energy from bringing value to a customer? What is it about that buying process and about getting to a contract with a client? What is it about that process that gives you satisfaction from the point of view of delivering value to another customer, to a customer? I think if you can define very crisply and clearly what's interesting to you and what's motivating to you about getting to that value-driven outcome, that I think goes a long way to establishing yourself as somebody who's in it for the right reasons, and who stands a chance of being in that state of plausible objectivity.
So it's interesting because we talked a lot during this conversation about understanding the buyer, yes, figuring out the answers to all of those questions, so that would help us elevate the conversation to the higher level.
Mm-hmm.
But if we talking about our online presence to get to that stage,
Mm-hmm.
in my mind, my understanding right now is you need to figure out first what it is that you are doing and why you are doing this. Yes, what's your goal? Not even your goal? What is like you said? What gives you energy? What gives you drive?
Yeah.
What is it that you are trying to change in the world that would make people listen and want to talk to you?
Yeah. I mean, it's this is, as with many of the things that we're talking about, we're dealing with some first principles of human psychology here, right? We're getting to the true underlying sources of what really matters, because it's a little bit like the sort of general life advice. Do you want to lead a life that is just about making money, or do you want to lead a life where you're trying to be useful to the broader community, and in being as useful as possible, money just becomes an indicator, it becomes some sort of external validation of what you're intrinsically motivated to do, but it is not the central driver for what it is for what you're doing, right? And I think that the seller needs to be just as clear on that. And there are some sellers who are purely coin-operated individuals, but I think all of us in the profession need to push ourselves to define what are the deeper sources of meaning, because that ultimately is not only, I mean, paradoxically, that is going to help you earn more money ultimately, but it needs to be, it needs to be clearly defined as your driving force, because it is going to give you much more motivation over the long term, and it is going to make you much more credible with a client if you can very credibly define those personal drivers.
This is fascinating. This is, again, you don't get to see these kind of things being taught, especially when it comes to the sales context. Douglas, I can't thank you enough for sharing all of these tips with us, all of your frameworks. This is something that I think will be really, really beneficial for anyone wanting to elevate their position as a salesperson, and potentially, in general, position as a professional within the business, right? Seeing themselves in a different way, reflecting on what is it, how they want to be seen, what they want to be achieved through what they do, and how is it that they are contributing to the world. I have to say, we started this conversation in a focusing on slightly different, no, it's all connected, I would say, it's all connected, right? You're trying to understand the client, trying to understand yourself, then figuring out how does that link also in the way that then you can provide as much value as possible. Does that make people true trusted advisors then?
Yeah, it's again through this. It's again through a much deeper level of empathy than is what is typically meant by empathy. I think that, just to give I'll give you a personal example from my own career, which I think has shaped a lot of this thinking, and you can see that it comes through in the frameworks we've been talking about. But I remember when I first joined LinkedIn, I actually initially wondered whether I'd made the right decision, and the reason for that was that I actually felt a little bit disconnected. I didn't really feel as though I was bringing my true self to work. I didn't really feel as though I was properly understood and valued, and I felt this general kind of social misalignment. And it started to bug me, and I started to initially develop this victim mentality and think that everything's sort of falling apart, and cursing myself for the wrong decision. And for me, the major turning point was when I started to snap out of it and said, listen, you need to focus on what you can control here. And the most important thing for you to ask yourself right now is not how everyone else is not understanding you, but how can you help people in this company? How can you help the clients of this company? What is distinctive about your background? You do have a bit of a different background. It's non-traditional. That's why you're finding it not so straightforward to connect with people. But you do have this non-traditional background. So how can you take that non-traditional background and help your colleagues in some way? That's what led me to start to develop the mini MBA program. How can you use it to help your customers? That's what pushed me to think, in a much deeper way about how to be an advisor to them. How can you just be of service and of value to the community? And it was only after that mental shift where I started to think much more deeply about what it was the community needed and how I could help it. That's when I actually really started to feel tremendous fulfillment in my career. And I think this is basically what we're talking about. So much of the negative emotion that we experience in sales is because we're beating ourselves up over not hitting a number or not achieving a particular performance milestone. And there's this reframe that happens, I think, that needs to happen, where you push yourself to ask, well, how can I help people? What is it that they need, and how can I uniquely support them? And it's once you start proving your worth within the community because of your focus on others that you start to feel much better about yourself. So that's fundamentally what we're talking about here.
I love this. Absolutely love this. Douglas, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being so generous with sharing your ideas and your experiences. I'm sure this will be of value for many. I really appreciate you dedicating this time to come and to join us. And I hope we'll get to speak again soon.
Thank you so much, Justine. It's great to see you, as I said.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.